A cleaning lady went to a job interview. But when she saw a photo of her own mother on the Millionaire's desk, she was shocked. Maria pulled the old wool sweater over her shoulders and took a last glance around her small, tidy apartment. It was early, and the morning sun just began to filter through the cracked blinds, casting a warm glow on the worn-out furniture. This was her sanctuary, the place she worked hard to maintain and the space that reminded her of what mattered most in life. But today, as she looked around, she felt a familiar tug of longing, the same feeling that had been growing stronger each day. Maria Hernandez was a cleaning lady, a profession she'd quietly devoted herself to for over 20 years. She'd scrubbed countless floors, dusted shelves she could never dream of owning, and made homes spotless for people who barely noticed her presence. Still, Maria did her job with grace, never resenting her clients. Her mother had taught her that all honest work was honorable, that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they did but by the heart they put into it. And her mother, Maria's guiding star, had lived by this very principle. Her mother had been the kind of woman who, despite having little herself, always gave generously to those in need. Maria remembered moments when a neighbor in trouble would knock at their door, and her mother would offer whatever she could spare, even if it meant they had to go without. Growing up, she'd seen her mother work long hours, her hands roughened by labor, but her spirit unyielded. These memories had always been a source of strength for Maria, guiding her in the moments when life felt unbearably hard. But now, at 45, Maria found herself dreaming of a life that might offer a little more than survival. Perhaps it was the quiet reflection that settled on her during her early morning walks to work or the recent phone call from her sister, who lived in another state and had shared that her daughter was excelling in school. It stirred something in Maria, a yearning for a life where she didn't have to calculate every dollar or worry about unexpected expenses. That morning, as Maria walked through her neighborhood, the familiar streets took on a different meaning. Today, she was planning to attend an interview at the office of Mr. George Roberts, a wealthy businessman who owned a chain of luxury hotels and several prestigious estates in the city. It was a long shot, she knew, but Maria had heard he was looking for someone to oversee cleaning staff in his corporate office. It was a role that promised better pay and a more stable schedule, an opportunity she could not ignore. Her heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The job itself was challenging, but the idea of setting foot in an environment so far removed from her daily life stirred insecurities she'd long buried. She reminded herself why she wanted this change, to finally create a future where she could breathe a little easier, maybe even support her niece's education, just as her mother would have wanted. In the back of her mind, she could almost hear her mother's voice, urging her forward. Her mother had always believed in Maria's strength, even when Maria herself doubted it. Today, she clung to that belief, letting it bolster her courage. Taking a deep breath, she whispered a quiet prayer, a habit from her childhood. "Mama," she said softly, "give me strength." With her heart full of hope and a deep resolve to make her mother proud, Maria straightened her posture and set out, ready to step into a world that might finally offer her a chance for something better. Maria stood in front of her small mirror, inspecting her reflection as she smoothed out the creases on her only formal blouse, an ivory shirt with delicate lace trim around the collar. The shirt had been a gift from a neighbor years ago, something Maria kept for special occasions, though if she was honest, she'd never quite felt she had a reason to wear it until today. She paired it with a plain gray skirt and a pair of polished low-heeled shoes. As she looked at herself, she felt the stirrings of confidence mingling with her ever-present nerves. "Look at you, Maria," she whispered to her reflection. "You're stronger than you think." It wasn't easy for Maria to embrace change. Her life had been shaped by routines and predictable rhythms, where safety lay in the familiarity of her daily tasks and modest goals. Taking on a new job with greater responsibility meant confronting the fears that had always held her back. She felt a flicker of doubt, the same doubt that had been there since she decided to apply for the position. Who was she to work in the office of a man as powerful as George Roberts? She wasn't educated, wasn't polished, wasn't anything like the people who probably worked there. But then Maria thought about what her mother would say if she were here. She could almost see her mother's warm, encouraging smile, Hear her gentle voice reminding her that no opportunity was too grand for someone willing to work for it. It was that memory that fueled her as she took a deep breath, gathered her things, and left her apartment, her heart racing with both fear and determination. The city was bustling as Maria boarded the bus that would take her to the financial district, a place she had only ever seen from afar. Her palms were sweaty as she clutched her purse tightly, watching the scenery change from modest neighborhoods to towering skyscrapers and sleek glass buildings. With every stop, she felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just a job. It was a step into a world she didn't understand, a world she feared might not understand her. Arriving downtown, Maria stepped off the bus and paused, letting her eyes adjust to the gleaming sight in front of her. The building where Mr. Roberts' office was located soared into the sky, its glossy, mirrored surface reflecting the world around it. She swallowed, feeling small yet determined. The sensation was almost overwhelming. She had never been inside such a building, let alone been expected there for an interview. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors, Maria entered a marble-floored lobby that gleamed under modern chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. For a moment she wanted to retreat, to turn back to her simple, safe life. But then she remembered her mother, the image of her encouraging smile urging her forward. The receptionist at the front desk greeted her with a polite nod, and Maria mustered her courage to explain she had an interview with Mr. Roberts. She was led to an elevator and instructed to go up to the top floor. With every floor the elevator passed, Maria's heart beat faster, her nerves intensifying. She clutched her purse, mentally running through the interview questions she had practiced the night before, though she feared they'd slip away in her anxiety. Finally, the doors opened, and she found herself in an elegant waiting area with plush leather chairs, a sleek coffee table, and tasteful artwork on the walls. She barely had a moment to take it in before a young woman approached, smiling warmly as she introduced herself and asked Maria to wait briefly before meeting Mr. Roberts. Maria nodded, grateful for the moment to catch her breath. Sitting there, her gaze wandered over the room's refined decor. This was a world of wealth and success that felt completely foreign to her. And yet Maria was here, ready to take her shot, ready to honor her mother's belief in her. When the door finally opened and she was invited into Mr. Roberts' office, Maria took a steadying breath, stood up and walked in. This was it, the moment that might change everything. Maria stepped into Mr. Roberts' office, her breath catching as she took in the space. Everything about the room seemed to exude power and prestige. Dark wood-paneled walls, large windows with sweeping city views, and furniture upholstered in rich, earthy tones. The shelves were lined with books whose spines gleamed gold, their titles in languages she could only guess at, and on one wall, a painting of a tranquil forest scene added an unexpected softness to the room's otherwise imposing ambience. A polished mahogany desk occupied the center of the room, its surface scattered with neat stacks of papers and a few personal items. Photos, trinkets, a beautiful pen set. Behind the desk sat Mr. George Roberts himself. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a well-trimmed beard that gave him an air of quiet authority. When he looked up and saw her, he broke into a warm smile that instantly put her a little more at ease. "Ms. Hernandez," he asked, rising from his chair and extending his hand. His voice was deep but gentle, and his handshake was firm, his eyes crinkling in genuine welcome as he motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him. "Yes, sir. Thank you for meeting with me," Maria replied, her voice barely concealing the nervous tremor beneath it. Mr. Roberts settled back into his chair, his gaze thoughtful yet kind. "Thank you for coming, Maria. I appreciate your time." This wasn't what Maria had expected at all. She had pictured a stern, no-nonsense man who would barely look at her and ask direct, cutting questions. But Mr. Roberts seemed at ease, his demeanor open and almost kind. Maria took a breath, feeling a small part of her anxiety lift. As he began asking her about her work experience and the kind of responsibilities she had managed in her past jobs, Maria felt a wave of relief. These were questions she knew how to answer, ones she had rehearsed with her sister over the phone. She spoke about her years of cleaning work, her attention to detail, and her commitment to doing her best even when the tasks were mundane or difficult. Mr. Roberts listened intently, nodding occasionally, making her feel heard. "Maria, I understand that this position would be a bit of a shift for you," he began after she had finished answering his latest question. "The responsibilities here would involve not only overseeing the cleanliness of our corporate offices, but also managing a small team. Do you think you're ready for that?" His question was fair, and Maria appreciated the honesty with which he asked it. She took a moment, glancing down at her hands. "Yes, sir, I believe I am. I know it will be a challenge, but I've always done my best to take care of my work and look out for those around me. I'm willing to learn whatever is needed to meet the standards here." Mr. Roberts nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "That's good to hear. I can see you take pride in your work, and that's something I admire." There was a warmth in his tone that caught Maria off guard. Sitting there, she felt a surprising comfort in his presence. Mr. Roberts seemed to look past her modest clothing and her background, treating her with a respect that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that she could truly belong somewhere better. But just as her confidence was beginning to build, her eyes drifted to the items on his desk, settling on a framed photograph that was partially hidden behind a stack of papers. Maria's breath hitched, her heart skipping as she stared at the familiar face in the frame. It was a photo of her mother, smiling brightly as if she were alive again, her warm eyes filled with kindness. Maria blinked, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Her mind raced as questions formed in her heart, the intensity of the emotions making it difficult to keep her composure. She looked back at Mr. Roberts, who seemed unaware of the shock rippling through her. Maria forced herself to stay calm. Her hands suddenly clenched tightly in her lap. Maria's pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to keep her expression neutral, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. The photograph on Mr. Roberts's desk wasn't just familiar. It was intimately woven into her past, a piece of her life she hadn't expected to encounter in this world of glass and marble. The woman in the photo was undeniably her mother. She was younger in the picture, dressed in the simple hand-sewn blouse Maria remembered vividly from childhood. Her mother's smile radiated warmth, and the corners of her eyes crinkled just the way they did when she laughed freely, unburdened by life's hardships. Maria's mother had been her entire world, her anchor. Seeing her now, framed and honored on a stranger's desk, stirred emotions she could barely contain. As Mr. Roberts continued speaking, Maria struggled to focus, nodding mechanically even though her mind was caught in a whirlpool of confusion and disbelief. How could her mother's picture be here? The photo was one she thought only her family owned, a keepsake that had survived the years, stored away in an old album in her sister's home. She remembered the day it had been taken. Her mother had posed by the small garden she'd cultivated outside their home, a garden she'd lovingly tended, even in the most challenging times. The moment was surreal. She felt as though her mother's presence was here in the room with her, comforting yet inexplicable. Maria wanted desperately to understand what her mother's photo was doing on the desk of a man like Mr. Roberts, a man who, by all accounts, had never crossed paths with her or her family before. The questions weighed heavily on her heart, colliding with the memories of her mother and the gentle strength she had always embodied. Mr. Roberts must have noticed her distraction, for he paused and tilted his head slightly, looking at her with mild concern. "Are you all right, Maria?" he asked, his voice soft, his tone genuinely kind. Maria forced herself to nod, hoping her voice wouldn't betray her. Yes, I'm fine, thank you." She managed a faint smile, but she could feel the cracks in her composure. Inside, her mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. "Forgive me," she added quickly, lowering her gaze. I noticed the photo on your desk. The woman in it. She looks a lot like my mother." Mr. Roberts looked over at the picture, his gaze softening as he picked it up and studied it for a moment. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. "She was a remarkable woman." He set the photo down gently, but didn't elaborate, his expression introspective. The way he spoke of her mother struck Maria. She could feel a deep reverence in his voice, a tenderness she hadn't expected. Her heart pounded as she sensed there was something more he wasn't saying, a story held back, hidden behind that carefully placed frame. Maria swallowed, struggling to keep her emotions in check. She knew now that this was no coincidence, but rather a mystery connecting her mother and this man she'd only just met. Every fiber of her being longed to know more, but she held back, fearing that if she pressed him, the delicate balance of the moment might shatter. So she sat, a silent storm of emotions within her, waiting for the right moment to learn how this man had known her mother and why he kept her picture so close. The call came just 2 days after the interview. When Maria saw the unfamiliar number flashing on her phone, she braced herself, heart racing as she answered with a tentative, "Hello? Ms. Hernandez. This is Mr. Roberts's office. We'd like to formally offer you the position." Relief and surprise flooded her. She thanked them, her voice a mix of gratitude and disbelief, and after a few more details were shared, Maria found herself with a new job and a future she hadn't dared hope for. Despite her lingering questions about the photograph, she was determined to do her best and see where this journey might lead her. On her first day, Maria arrived early, wanting to prove her dedication right from the start. The building felt no less intimidating than it had during her interview, but she squared her shoulders, reminding herself that she belonged here, just as much as anyone else. Her duties were straightforward but involved overseeing a small team of cleaning staff and ensuring that the office remained immaculate and welcoming. With a sense of pride, Maria threw herself into the work, keen to set a good example. She ensured every detail was attended to, from the pristine polish on the floors to the spotless arrangement of desks and common spaces. There was something almost sacred about creating an environment where people could work in peace and comfort, and she took pleasure in knowing her efforts contributed to the sense of calm. In the days that followed, Maria observed Mr. Roberts carefully, her curiosity about him growing with each encounter. She noticed how his employees greeted him with a mix of admiration and genuine warmth, and he returned their greetings with a kind smile and words of encouragement. It was clear that Mr. Roberts wasn't the cutthroat executive Maria had initially expected. Instead, he seemed invested in his team's well-being, taking the time to chat with people as he moved through the office, often stopping to ask about their families or offer words of appreciation. One morning, as Maria was arranging fresh flowers in the lobby, she overheard 2 employees talking in hushed tones by the coffee station. "Did you hear about Mr. Roberts's latest charity donation?" one woman asked, clearly impressed. "He's funding another shelter downtown, this one for families who've lost their homes." "Yeah," replied the other, "and he doesn't just throw money around. I heard he actually visits these places and talks with the people there. He's not like other CEOs, you know." Maria paused, pretending to adjust the flowers as she listened. This didn't sound like the businessman she'd imagined when she'd first learned of him. The more she observed Mr. Roberts's kindness and humility, the more she was reminded of her mother, a woman who had always gone out of her way to help others, even when she had little herself. Each day, Maria's curiosity deepened. She wanted to know the connection between her mother and Mr. Roberts, a link she felt but couldn't yet fully understand. As she tidied his office in the quiet hours after everyone had left, she would sometimes catch herself gazing at the photo on his desk, wondering if she'd ever learn the truth. For now, though, she held on to the hope that working here would, in time, reveal the answers she sought. In her heart, Maria sensed that her mother's spirit was guiding her, leading her towards something she hadn't yet dared to imagine. One quiet afternoon, as Maria was refilling supplies in the break room, she overheard 2 of her colleagues talking. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the mention of Mr. Roberts's name caught her attention. "I still can't believe how much he's changed," said one of the employees, a woman named Sheila. "If you'd seen him 10 years ago, you wouldn't recognize him. He was absolutely ruthless back then." "Really?" asked the younger man she was talking to, clearly surprised. "He's always so polite and kind whenever I see him." "What was he like?" Sheila shook her head, her voice dropping slightly. "Oh, he was a completely different person. Back in those days, it was all about money and power for him. If something wasn't making him money, he'd shut it down without a second thought. People were afraid of him. He fired anyone who didn't meet his standards. They used to call him the Iron Hand behind his back. The young man chuckled, disbelieving. Mr. Roberts. The guy who organizes all those charity events and funds those shelters. Yes, Sheila said, her tone softening. But something changed. One day, out of nowhere, he just softened. He started talking about giving back to the community, and he began funding charity projects. It was like he became a different person overnight. As the conversation drifted to other topics, Maria stood frozen, processing this new information. Her thoughts were racing. The Mr. Roberts she saw every day was a man of kindness, warmth, and generosity. But hearing about his past as a ruthless businessman, willing to do anything for success, painted a picture that felt at odds with the man she now knew. The more she thought about it, the more Maria wondered what had caused such a profound transformation. People didn't just change without reason, especially people in powerful positions like Mr. Roberts. What had happened in his life to turn him from a figure of fear into a man respected for his compassion? Could it have something to do with her mother? Her heart pounded as she considered this possibility. Her mother had a way of touching people's lives, of reaching out to those who were hurting and lost. Maria remembered how her mother had once taken in a struggling neighbor's child for several months, simply because the child's mother was going through a difficult time. No matter who it was, her mother's kindness knew no boundaries. Could it be that her mother had somehow met Mr. Roberts during those years he was known as the Iron Hand? And if so, had she played a role in helping him change? The questions gnawed at Maria, her curiosity building with each passing day. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to uncovering the truth, a truth that somehow connected her mother's memory to this place, to this man. In the following days, she found herself looking at Mr. Roberts with new eyes, searching for hints of the man he once was. But all she saw was a man who treated his employees with respect, a man who cared about his community and seemed to genuinely want to make a difference. Whatever had happened in his past, it was clear that he was dedicated to being a better person. Maria decided then that she couldn't rest until she found the courage to ask him directly. She knew it was risky, that it might be too personal, but she felt a pull to understand, a pull she couldn't ignore. In the quiet moments when she worked late or found herself in his office, she rehearsed the words in her mind, searching for a way to ask about her mother without crossing a line. For now, though, she held back, waiting for the right moment, when she'd be ready to uncover the story that connected their lives in ways she was only beginning to imagine. Days turned into weeks, but Maria couldn't shake the lingering questions that had taken root in her mind. Each time she caught a glimpse of her mother's photo on Mr. Roberts's desk, the urgency to understand grew stronger. She knew there was a story there, something hidden, something that linked her mother's life to this man's in ways she had yet to uncover. And yet, every time she thought she'd gathered the courage to ask, her nerves betrayed her. But today was different. The office was quieter than usual, and Mr. Roberts was alone in his office, the golden afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. Maria had finished her work for the day, but as she stood at the threshold of his office, she felt a sense of purpose wash over her. This was her moment. She took a deep breath, rehearsing her words in her mind one last time, then knocked gently on the open door. Mr. Roberts looked up from his paperwork, his expression softening when he saw her. "Maria, come in. Is everything all right?" he asked, setting his pen down and giving her his full attention. "Yes, Mr. Roberts. Everything is fine," she began, her voice steady, though her hands were clasped tightly together. She paused, gathering the strength to continue. "I actually wanted to ask you something, if that's all right." He nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat across from him. Maria hesitated, but then lowered herself into the chair, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced briefly at the photo on his desk, her mother's smile beaming back at her, encouraging her forward. "That photo on your desk," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woman in it, she was my mother." Mr. Roberts's face registered a mixture of surprise and something deeper, perhaps recognition or a memory stirred. He looked at the photo, then back at Maria, his expression thoughtful. "Your mother," he murmured, his gaze softening as he leaned back in his chair. His eyes clouded with memory. "I had a feeling there was something familiar about you, but I couldn't place it. Your mother. She was an extraordinary woman." Maria's heart beat faster as she listened. Her anticipation mixed with a growing sense of awe. "You knew her?" Mr. Roberts nodded slowly, his face taking on a look of reverence she hadn't seen before. He took a deep breath, clearly grappling with his own memories before he spoke. "Yes, I met her many years ago. At a time in my life when I was not the man you see before you. She was one of the kindest, most selfless people I'd ever met." There was a pause as he collected his thoughts, his expression distant as he gazed at the photo. "I was struggling then, Maria. My life was consumed with ambition, with building an empire and proving myself. I didn't care about anyone else, only my own success." "But your mother," he stopped, his voice breaking slightly, then continued. "Your mother saw right through me. She had this remarkable ability to look past the surface, to see the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it." Maria felt a lump rise in her throat, her mother's presence filling the room in a way that was almost tangible. She had known her mother was kind, but hearing about it from someone else, someone like Mr. Roberts, was deeply moving. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. She sensed this was a story that had profoundly changed him. Mr. Roberts took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Your mother changed everything for me, Maria," he said quietly. "I'll tell you the whole story, if you'd like to hear it." Maria nodded, her heart full as she prepared to listen. She knew, in this moment, that the story he was about to share would explain not only her mother's presence in his life, but also the man Mr. Roberts had become. Mr. Roberts leaned forward, his eyes distant as he recalled a memory that seemed to transport him far from the elegant office they sat in. "It was over a decade ago," he began softly, his voice touched with the weight of long-buried emotions. "I was at a crossroads. My life looked perfect from the outside. I had wealth, power, and influence. But inside I felt empty. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't want to be." Maria watched him, her heart aching as she imagined the pain he must have felt in those dark moments. Mr. Roberts seemed vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected, stripped of the confidence and authority he usually wore like armor. "One night, after another long day at the office, I went for a drive to clear my head," he continued. "I ended up in a part of town I hadn't visited in years. Everything was quiet, the streets empty. I don't know why I stopped, but there was this little diner, and something about it felt like an escape. I went inside, hoping to find some solitude." He smiled faintly, glancing at the photo of Maria's mother on his desk. "That's where I met her. Your mother was working there, waiting tables in the late hours. She noticed me sitting alone, looking, well, defeated. She came over with a cup of coffee and asked if I was all right, in that gentle, unassuming way of hers." Maria's breath hitched. She could picture her mother in that moment, kind and warm, always reaching out to others, no matter who they were or what they carried with them. "At first, I didn't say much. But there was something about her presence that put me at ease. It was as if she saw right through me, and that was terrifying and comforting all at once." He shook his head, almost smiling at the memory. "She stayed, sitting across from me even though I was a stranger, and we talked. She listened as I poured out my frustrations, my regrets. Everything I thought I could never tell anyone." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked back at Maria. "Your mother didn't judge me. She just listened, and then she told me something I'll never forget. She said, 'A life lived only for yourself is a life half lived.' She told me about the importance of giving, of finding joy in helping others, and of looking beyond my own needs." Maria felt tears gathering in her eyes, her heart swelling with pride and sorrow. Her mother had always seen the good in people, even when they were at their lowest. It didn't surprise her that her mother had reached out to Mr. Roberts, offering him the comfort and guidance he so desperately needed. Mr. Roberts took a shaky breath, his eyes glistening. "That night changed me, Maria. I went back to that diner a few more times, hoping to see her again, and each time she shared some piece of wisdom, some bit of kindness that helped me start to reshape my life. I began to think about my choices, my actions, and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. It was because of her that I started to give back, to find purpose beyond the bottom line. Everything I've done since, it's been in her honor. Maria's tears spilled over, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and grief. She had always known her mother was remarkable, but hearing how her kindness had transformed someone's life in such a profound way left her in awe. Mr. Roberts's voice softened as he finished, his gaze meeting hers. Your mother saved me, Maria. She taught me how to be a better person, and I've tried every day to live up to her example. I keep her photo here to remind me of the life she wanted for me, a life filled with purpose and compassion. Maria nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She could see now that her mother's legacy was alive, woven into the life of this man who had once been lost but had found his way, thanks to her mother's unwavering kindness. It was a connection she never expected, but one that filled her with profound gratitude, a feeling that her mother's spirit was still guiding her, even from beyond. For a few moments, silence filled the room as Maria and Mr. Roberts sat across from each other, connected by the powerful memory of her mother's kindness. Maria's heart was full, emotions flooding her as she finally understood the depth of her mother's legacy, a legacy that had shaped not just her life, but the life of a man she once thought a stranger. Thank you, Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for telling me. I always knew my mother was a special woman, but hearing how much she meant to you, it means the world to me. Mr. Roberts nodded, his eyes soft with gratitude. It's I who should be thanking you, Maria. I've held on to these memories for so long, not realizing that one day I'd have the chance to tell her daughter what she meant to me. Your mother's spirit, it's alive in you. You carry her kindness, her strength. Maria wiped a tear from her cheek, feeling her mother's presence in a way that was almost tangible, as if she were right there, proud of the woman Maria had become. There was a healing in this moment, a sense of closure she hadn't even realized she needed. Her mother's legacy wasn't just something of the past. It was a light that continued to shine, illuminating lives she hadn't even known about. As the two of them sat together in that quiet, sacred space, Mr. Roberts leaned forward, a thoughtful look in his eyes. Maria, I'd like to propose something, he began, his tone gentle yet full of purpose. I've been thinking about expanding the Foundation's work, reaching deeper into the community to offer programs that can make a lasting difference. And I'd like you to be a part of that. Maria's eyes widened, taken aback by his words. Me? She asked, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Yes, you, he replied with a reassuring smile. Your mother was the heart of the kindness that inspired this foundation. I think it would be fitting for you to help lead the next steps in her honor. You know these communities well, and you understand what it means to serve others. I believe you'd bring a perspective and compassion that could truly carry her legacy forward. For a moment, Maria couldn't speak. The offer felt like a dream, something she'd never imagined possible. Her mother's legacy, her gentle wisdom, her boundless kindness, had been quietly guiding Maria all along. And now, she had the chance to carry that torch herself, to continue the work her mother had started. Finally, Maria looked up, her voice steady with a new sense of purpose. I'd be honored, Mr. Roberts. I would love to help carry on my mother's legacy. I know she'd be proud of the work you've done, and I'd be proud to be a part of it. Mr. Roberts smiled, his expression one of shared understanding. Then let's make it happen, Maria. Together, we'll continue what she began. As they shook hands, Maria felt a surge of gratitude and fulfillment, knowing that her mother's kindness would live on in her work, reaching even more lives. In that moment, she felt a renewed sense of connection to her mother, a sense that her mother's spirit was with her, guiding her as she embarked on this new journey. As Maria rose from her seat, the weight she'd carried for years felt lighter, as if her mother's spirit had lifted her burdens alongside her. This unexpected journey, starting with the photograph, the hidden story, and now this profound moment of connection, had brought her closer to understanding the depth of her mother's love and generosity. She could sense the healing that had settled into the space between her and Mr. Roberts, a healing that transcended words, something deep and quietly sacred. In the days that followed, Maria's life took on a new rhythm. She began to work with Mr. Roberts on his foundation, diving into projects that supported struggling families, creating educational opportunities, and helping to fund shelters for the homeless. Each time she attended a meeting or made plans for a community project, she felt her mother's influence guiding her decisions, whispering encouragement in those quiet, reflective moments. Mr. Roberts became more than an employer to her. He was a friend and a partner in their shared mission, and their collaboration grew from mutual respect and gratitude. Together, they honored the memory of a woman who had shown him compassion in his darkest hour, a kindness that had, without Maria even realizing it, shaped her own life in unimaginable ways. One evening, after a long day of planning for the opening of a community center funded by the foundation, Maria returned to her modest apartment. As she set her bag down and looked around, she felt a sense of peace that filled every corner of her home. She pulled out an old worn album from her bookshelf, the same one where she kept her mother's photo, her mother's smile beaming back at her from those fragile pages. With a hand over her heart, Maria whispered softly, "Mama, I hope I'm making you proud." She closed the album, feeling the strength of her mother's legacy not as a weight but as a light, something that would continue to shine through every life she touched. Her mother's kindness had lived on in Mr. Roberts, and now it would live on in her, a part of her heart she could carry forward with purpose and love. The next morning, as Maria prepared to step back into her role, she looked out at the rising sun, feeling renewed. Her journey had been unexpected, but it had led her to exactly where she was meant to be, a place where she could create ripples of compassion, just as her mother had, and continue the work that would live on for generations to come. In the quiet moments of her new life, Maria found herself often reflecting on how far she had come, not only in her career but in her understanding of her own purpose. What had started as a simple job interview had evolved into a journey that uncovered the beauty and depth of her mother's legacy. Maria saw now that her mother's kindness had been a gift, one that continued to live on in every life it touched. It was a reminder that even the smallest gestures of compassion could create waves that went far beyond the initial act. As Maria and Mr. Roberts's foundation grew, they launched new initiatives, reaching people who, like Maria's mother, struggled quietly but deserved dignity and support. Each project, each person they helped, was an extension of her mother's legacy, a life lived not only for oneself but for the good of others. With every ribbon cut at a new shelter or program funded for young students, Maria felt her mother's spirit there, guiding her as she and Mr. Roberts honored her mother's memory together. Maria had come to realize that kindness, no matter how small, held an almost magical quality. Her mother's empathy had healed a man lost in his own darkness, and through him had changed the course of Maria's own life. Her mother's legacy had become her guiding light, a reminder that in a world often filled with challenges, love and compassion had the power to transform even the hardest of hearts. Every day, Maria was reminded of this lesson. The truest riches lay not in material wealth but in the impact we leave on others. Her mother's kindness had planted seeds that, over the years, had blossomed in unexpected places, bringing healing and hope to people Maria had never met. And now, Maria knew it was her turn to carry that light forward. As she looked out over the city from the Foundation's office, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had become part of something much greater than herself, an unbroken chain of kindness, passed down from her mother and continuing on, one act at a time. Her mother's legacy was no longer just a memory but a living force that Maria, Mr. Roberts, and countless others would carry on. In her heart, she felt her mother's presence, a quiet yet powerful reassurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. And as Maria continued her work, she knew that each moment of compassion would echo out, weaving a tapestry of kindness that would live on long after her own time had passed. Maria's story is a powerful reminder of the impact each of us can have through simple acts of kindness. Her mother's gentle compassion, extended with humility and grace, created a ripple that spread across generations, changing lives and lighting the path for others to follow. Through Maria's journey, we see that kindness and love are not only gifts we give in the moment but legacies we leave for those who come after us. As Maria learned, even the smallest gestures, a listening ear, a helping hand, can create profound change. Her mother's kindness had not only lifted Mr. Roberts from a place of darkness, but also inspired him to spread that light to others. Now, Maria continues that legacy, reminding us all that we have the power to make a difference. If this story has touched you, take a moment to reflect on the people who have shown you kindness and compassion in your own life. Maybe it was a parent, a friend, a teacher, or even a stranger whose small act of generosity left an unforgettable impact. Think of how their influence has shaped who you are, and consider how you might carry their legacy forward. Share this story with those you love, and if you feel inspired, leave a comment with a story of kindness that has touched your life. By sharing these experiences, we can create a community of empathy and compassion, a place where love is celebrated and lives on, just as it did through Maria's mother. Let's honor those who showed us the way with love and keep that light shining. Together we can make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time.